So you're Europe in 1944. As a continent, you've been through a lot these past few decades. Yet despite all the destruction and power-hungry dictators sapping you dry, you've always managed to bounce back. And one of the reasons for that was colonialism. Ah yes, those were the good old days when all a European colonizer needed was a flag and the audacity to claim the land for themselves. And no other continent on Earth made you quite as thirsty as Africa. Rubber, tea, wood, coca, ivory, gold, diamonds. These were just some of Africa's most sought-after resources. And back in the late 1800s, everyone wanted a piece of the action. Britain, France, Portugal, Spain, Germany, Belgium. They couldn't wait to get their hands on all those expensive resources they could exploit. And if someone didn't lay down some ground rules, there would be an all-out war for control over Africa. So you did what any good colonizer would do to keep the peace. And in 1884, you got everyone around the table to divide up the continent between all of you. That way, everyone could have their own fair share of Africa's wealth. Well, everyone except for the actual Africans, but who cares about them? And for a while, your little system worked perfectly. Even after World War I, you managed to use all those African resources to pay for and repair all the damage the war caused. But then World War II came around, and suddenly things became ugly. See, you had gotten so used to exploiting Africa for whatever you needed, that when the war started and you needed more soldiers and men, you thought, well, we're already taking Africa's stuff, we might as well take the people too. So you forced hundreds of thousands of Africans from Algeria to South Africa to enlist into your armies and war campaigns. And that was the last straw. Not only were you tapping Africa dry of all its resources, but now you were coming for its people too? The African people had no interest on who came out on top of your little world war. Enough was enough. It was time for Africa to take back what was theirs. So in 1945, just as you were calculating how many diamonds, gold, coca, and rubber it would cost to rebuild all the cities you destroyed, Africa put its foot down. One by one, African countries either negotiated or went to war with their colonizers for independence. And since you were running really low on pretty much everything thanks to World War II, those African countries had the upper hand. One by one, your biggest sources of diamonds, gold, wood, tea, ivory, and all those other resources you loved were being ripped away from your control. It was an absolute nightmare. Before, you simply went to these countries and paid local workers just enough money to mine it out of the ground for you for it to not be considered slavery. But now, all these new independent African countries wanted to sell those same resources to you. These savages actually wanted you to pay for it, so they could have money for healthcare and education and roads and cities. Who do they think you are, Santa Claus? There was no way you as Europe could rebuild, develop, and survive without the resources Africa held, but there was also no way you were going to give in and actually pay the Africans for any of it either. You needed to come up with a new plan, a new way to continue to enslave Africa, to force them to give you what you want, to let your European businesses continue stealing their resources, all the while giving them the illusion that they're free. And what is the best way to do that? Debts. Mountains and mountains of debts. Think about it, Africa may have loads of resources, but without the money to buy machinery and infrastructure to actually extract those resources, it doesn't matter a bit. Gold in the ground is not going to pay for roads and hospitals, so this newly independent Africa would need your assistance. So what if you created an organization? What if you gave this organization an innocent sounding name like the International Monetary Fund or the World Bank or something? And what if you use those organizations to offer loans to these African countries so they could finally start harvesting all their resources? On the surface, it would look like you're doing them a massive favor. But in the fine print, it would give you complete control over the money they earn from these resources. It would ensure that none of the money they earn could be reinvested back into their country, that all that money would go straight back to you, that the loans would be so big, that the repayment terms would be so strict, that they would never be able to pay you back in full. Well, if you put all of that in the fine print, you would have de facto control over Africa, its resources, and its governments once again. Except this time, the entire population will live under the illusion that they're actually free. It was the perfect plan, and guess what? No one reads the fine prints. Stay dangerous, and this is why Africa is poor. If you run a business in Africa or not, it can be really expensive paying for all these different apps that you need to use, which is where Odoo comes in. Odoo is an all-in-one platform that combines practically every single app you could ever pay for all under one roof. This means you can save literally hundreds if not a few $1,000s every year just by switching over. It has a time tracking app for your employees, an accounting app to replace your QuickBooks plan, invoicing, point of sale, electronic signature. It even has apps for inventory management and project management. Not to mention apps for building full-blown websites selling courses. It even has an SMS marketing app and digital phone numbers for your business. And here's the best part. With Odoo, you get all this for as low as $24.90 per user. Think about it, you're probably already paying just as much as that for just one of these apps alone. Like take their document signing app for example. DocuSign literally costs just as much as Odoo for their standard plan, while Odoo's app is just as good and you get all these other apps. Or take their accounting app. It's arguably easier and cleaner to use than QuickBooks, even though people pay anywhere from $15 to $100 per month for QuickBooks. Basically, you get $2,000 worth of apps for under $25 per user. And the best part is that you can try all this out for free without having to enter your credit card information when you pause the video and click the link below. You can even get free lifetime access to one app of your choice in the Odoo suite if you don't need the rest. So click the link below and try Odoo for free. And thanks to them for sponsoring this video. The modern world as we know it today would not be possible without Africa. Just take the Democratic Republic of the Congo for example. In 2023, it produced more than 70% of the world's cobalt for our smartphones, computers, and of course, our beloved electric cars. Africa is also home to 1/3 of the world's critical mineral supply. We're talking copper, lithium, nickel, platinum. 65% of the world's fertile agricultural land is also found in Africa, and without it, there would be many food shortages. And every year, the production and sale of all these resources produce billions of dollars in revenue. In 2019, Africa's mineral resources alone produced $406 billion. And we're not even talking about the other stuff like fish, crops, or timber. So why then, even with all these resources and all the money they produce, is Africa still considered the poorest continent on Earth? How is it possible that almost every person in Africa lives below the poverty line? Meaning that they live on less than $1.25 a day. Well, the answer lies partially in the good old International Monetary Fund, or the IMF, and the World Bank. See, back in 1944, the IMF and the World Bank were created by European countries as a way to help each other rebuild after the war. The IMF would be responsible for regulating trade and giving a few loans here and there, while the World Bank would mainly focus on offering loans to European countries and Japan. And the only way a country could get loans from the World Bank was by becoming a member of the IMF. And at first, it was only European and Asian countries interested in joining. No one really cared about the struggling African countries, as long as they could keep taking Africa's resources. But then, all those African countries started becoming independent, remember? And suddenly, the IMF and the World Bank saw a brand new opportunity to do a little recolonization on the down low.
The World Bank and IMF were created to help stabilize and sort of rebuild Europe and Japan. And once that was done, unfortunately, they were repurposed to extract resources and cheap labor from the developing world. The bank and the fund allowed the former imperial powers to continue like this colonial dynamic of draining resources from poor countries to support them. And that is, of course, the total opposite of what they say they do. Like the IMF doesn't have guns. So whereas the British or the French or the Americans in the Philippines would go and impose a system where they're like, we're going to take the gold from here. You're going to work and help us get this rubber from over here. And we're going to take it home and we're not going to pay you a fair rate, if anything. You know, that was like old school colonialism or like slavery or whatever. This doesn't entail violence. This uses debt as a weapon.
On the surface, the promises made by the IMF and the World Bank seemed like everything a newly independent African country could hope for. Don't worry if you don't have the money to start harvesting your resources. We've got more than enough to go around. We'll help you become rich and successful. Just sign on the dotted line, please. According to the IMF itself, it quote works to achieve sustainable growth and prosperity for all its members. Wow, doesn't that sound nice? Maybe this was the West's way of making up to Africa after all those years of tapping it dry. Maybe they finally developed a conscience. Whatever the case, these African countries desperately needed whatever financial help they could get. So they bought into the IMF's pretty little promises, and one by one, all those new African countries joined the IMF. To the rest of the world, it looked like the IMF and the World Bank were doing Africa a solid. They were helping them, giving them billions to develop and grow. What a charitable thing to do. But in reality, none of that money was charity at all. They weren't donations, they were loans. Loans these African countries would have to pay back or else. But no one thought about that back then. All the African countries saw was an answer to their prayers. Their shot at finally becoming as rich and developed as everyone else. But little did they know that they had just walked straight into the West's very best colonial-shaped trap. Here's how it works. Let's say you're an underdeveloped African country in the 80s. You desperately need money to give your people an education, to buy the machinery to mine your minerals, and to build the infrastructure to move all these minerals around. But you've been colonized for the past 100 plus years, so you pretty much have no money. The Europeans took all of it. But one day you hear about the IMF and the World Bank. You hear about how they're offering huge amounts of money to help African countries grow. It sounds like the perfect solution to all your problems. If you could just get your hands on some of that money, you could educate your people, train them to open up businesses, and you can start extracting these resources and selling them for our profits. So you join the IMF. You apply for a loan, let's say $1 billion, and the IMF tells you they're more than happy to give you that money at 8% interest. Because obviously, with all that developing and educating you're gonna do, you're gonna make way more than just $1 billion, so the loan should be super easy to pay off. In fact, don't even worry about the fine prints. That's just boring stuff that applies to the worst case scenario. You'll never be struggling to pay off your loan. You're gonna prosper and grow just like Europe, remember? So you sign on the dotted line, and you start putting that money to use. But here's the thing. By the end of the first year, you already need to pay the IMF $80 million in interest. And educating people, setting up businesses, and harvesting resources takes a lot of time. So the deadline of your first interest payment comes up, and guess what? You can't pay. Don't worry about it, the IMF tells you. We planned for something like this, it's not a big deal. But since you already missed your deadline, the fine print says we need to step in and help you make that payment. So the IMF generously sends over its advisors and consultants. And they introduce you a little thing called structural reform. According to them, these structural reforms are just their suggestions to help you use their money wisely, so that you can make enough new money so you don't miss that next deadline. But in reality, those structural reforms give them absolute control over your economy.
The goal of structural adjustment is to change the society of a poor country, to make it focus on exports at the expense of consumption.
And here's where things get interesting. Because most of the time, that first $1 billion the IMF gave you, you spent it on trying to improve people's lives by building schools, hospitals, roads, whatever. So even though you want to start selling your resources, by then you would have spent all the loan money already. But luckily, the IMF is here to help again. Don't worry if you can't mine all those resources or plant all those crops. Just let our companies do it for you, they say. And since all of this is required in the fine print of the loans that you signed, you have no choice but to accept. And just like that, all those Western businesses are right back to where they were before colonialism ended. They're taking your resources and giving you small change in return. But hold on, it gets worse. Because not only are the Western businesses back and stealing your stuff, you still don't have any money. Sure, you've made a few interest payments on your loans, but those Western businesses aren't paying nearly enough taxes to give you anything to work with. So you're forced to take another loan. Only this time, the fine print is even stricter. It requires even more reforms. I mean, how can the IMF trust you won't miss your payments on this new loan like you did last time? No, they need a little reassurance. They need a little collateral. So they say they'll give you a loan only if you raise taxes on your citizens and cut down on government spending on them. That means less education and less social programs. Obviously the responsible thing to do, right? Trim the fat to make sure you're not spending on anything that isn't absolutely necessary. Except now you're $2 billion in debt, your resources are being plundered by Western businesses, and your own people are becoming poorer and poorer so you can keep paying for it all. But why stop there? The IMF has come so far already. They've taken control of your entire economy, so why not take it one step further? Once your currency gets devalued, you are screwed. See, all the taxes you rely on to make your interest payments every year are paid in your own local currency, but the loans the IMF gave you, those loans are in dollars. Which means you now have to pay even more of your own money to keep up with all the interest you owe. It's basically the equivalent of you signing a $1 billion loan, but then that loan magically grows to $1.5 billion. And since most of your people are working below minimum wage by Western businesses mining minerals and harvesting crops, it's not long before you hit rock bottom. By the time your next payment is due, you are flat out broke. There's no money available to make over $160 million in interest payments. So what do? You go to the IMF again, of course. You ask them for another loan so you can pay back your first loan. And just like a loan shark, they're more than happy to help. But you can't keep doing this. You have to start running your economy properly or else you'll go bankrupt, they tell you. And you know what that means. More fine print, more control for the IMF, also known as the West, and more debts. And the cycle just keeps repeating itself over and over again. And it's not just 1 or 2 African countries here and there that fell for the scheme. Today, only 3 African countries have never taken IMF loans. These countries are Botswana, Eritrea, and Libya. And we all know what happened to Libya, right? And in every last one of those 52 countries, the IMF has used that debt to keep the people poor while shipping all their resources to the West. Say hello to the richest country in the world. The Democratic Republic of the Congo, or DRC, previously known as Zaire, is sitting on an estimated $24 trillion worth of untapped raw minerals. Gold, copper, oil, and cobalt are just some of the DRC's biggest exports. But you wouldn't know that looking at these pictures, because even though the DRC has more mineral wealth than any country on Earth, the average person in the DRC only makes around $1.50 a day, or an annual income of just $610. For comparison, Saudi Arabia only has around $2.5 trillion in untapped mineral resources, and yet its average annual income is around $54,000. Much more than the $610 from the DRC. How did this happen? How did one of the most resource-rich countries on Earth also end up as one of the poorest? Well, according to the World Bank, it's because the DRC has a long history of conflict, political upheaval, and instability, and authoritarian rule, which is a nice way of saying that them being poor is 100% their own fault. But is it really? Or is it because of the West, the World Bank, and the IMF? See, before colonialism ended, the Congo was pretty much owned by King Leopold of Belgium. He basically claimed it as his own personal colony and spent years stealing the country's resources and enslaving its people. And after a long fight for freedom, the Congo finally got its independence in 1960, and they elected Patrice Lumumba as its prime minister. Lumumba's plan was to nationalize all the businesses in the Congo, which meant putting all the mines and export companies under the government's control. But that was a problem for the West. See, the Congo has always been one of the West's favorite cheap sources of minerals and natural resources. And now this democratically elected guy was threatening to take it all away? But luckily, Lumumba's plan didn't get far. Because in a totally unrelated incident, for totally unrelated reasons, Lumumba was assassinated just 6 months after taking power. And who did the assassinating? Well, elements within the Congolese army, assisted by Belgian and US governments. With Lumumba dead, the US took its chance to put someone in charge of the DRC who would be easier to influence.
In the 60s, you had a guy named General Joseph Mobutu. He came to power. He said he would live on a soldier's salary. That's what he promised the people. He ended up becoming like a Cold War ally of the United States. We wanted to back Mobutu. He was one of our allies in the region. We didn't necessarily care about the massive human rights violations that he perpetrated against his own people. What we would do is we would go in and we would prop up these regimes with infusions of large amounts of capital in exchange for conditionality. What we would get out of supporting him were 3 things. We would get interest payments, we would get cheap resources and labor, and we would get control.
When it came down to it, the IMF and the World Bank didn't care if this general was a dictator, or that he was committing human rights crimes against his own people. All they saw was someone they could buy. So they made a deal with the devil and started pumping massive amounts of money into the country as loans. And since the general was obviously taking a lot of the money for himself, he didn't care what the fine print said.
As a condition for the loan, Zaire gave up control over their economy to the IMF, meaning the government of Zaire had to place IMF officials in its government, in the treasury, in control of the economy. And we would shape the economy.
Under this general, Zaire's external debt went from 5% of the country's GDP to 150%. And by the 1990s, the IMF had forced the DRC to privatize almost all of its profitable businesses and to sell control of these companies to foreign investors so they could keep making their loan repayments. The strategy worked so well that an official World Bank document literally recommends, quote, "Private investors should own and operate mines. The government should promote private investment. Existing state mining companies should be privatized at the earliest opportunity," end quotes. See, they don't even try to hide their plans anymore because they already own the entire continent. Today, Africa owes the IMF more than $42 billion, and the World Bank over $124 billion, and Africa is paying for it big time. See, the more an African country relies on the IMF and the World Bank, the poorer it gets, which is ironically the exact opposite of what the IMF pitches. And that is not an exaggeration, it is the truth. Because out of all the countries in Africa, only 3 have never taken a loan from the IMF, and they are way better off than everyone else. Take Botswana for example. It's one of the world's leading producers of diamonds, and it's never taken a loan from the IMF. In 2022, its public debt was only 18% of GDP, while its economy is expected to keep growing massively. But instead of appreciating the fact that Botswana is doing so well on its own, the World Bank is a little salty when it publishes its annual reviews of the country's economy. Quote, "Efforts to diversify the investor base are needed to tackle the market liquidity challenges," end quotes. What do you think diversify the investor base means? The World Bank also says that Botswana is, quote, "challenged by a culture that shuns debts." What a terrible thing not to want debts. And lastly, quote, Botswana's infrastructure investment financing has traditionally been provided by the public sector, but the need to crowd in private investment is increasingly recognized, end quotes. And then there's Libya, another country that never borrowed from the IMF. Under Muammar Gaddafi's rule, Libya uses oil and gold money to make huge improvements in the country, including new educational programs, better healthcare, better housing, and subsidies for electricity and food. At one point, Gaddafi was even planning to create an African central bank, complete with its own gold-backed currency, to fight back against the IMF and the World Bank. Conveniently, the US ended up backing a rebel uprising in Libya that killed Gaddafi, complete with a whole US NATO invasion, just as Libya got a little too developed and a little too powerful. Oh yeah, and the US military conveniently also happened to confiscate $30 billion that the Libyan government has set aside to start its new African central bank. For more than 80 years, the IMF and the World Bank has used debt to enslave Africa and to keep the boot on their neck, stealing their resources, forcing them to work the lowest possible wage, and then robbing them of that already low wage by forcing these countries to raise their taxes to pay off the loans. All the while the West grows richer and richer from it, while blaming their poverty on them. But lately, the tide has been turning. People are starting to wake up to who the real slave masters are. In Kenya, there have been protests going on against a new finance bill that would increase taxes even more on these poor people, or you guessed it, to pay for all these interest payments. Niger, on the other hand, just expelled a French uranium mining giant that was getting uranium for dirt cheap for nuclear reactors. The question now is, are more countries going to start rebelling? Are they going to start calling off their predatory loans? Or is it already too late?